Hello, this is the lab solution for build your first app using external authentication by using the IBM Single Sign-on service. This service is a service that requires a paid account in Bluemix, so you may be watching this video because you didn't get a chance to do this on your own. So I'll go slowly and explain several of the steps along the way here, but we'll pretty much follow the outline of the lab document. We're going to start off here by creating a Cloud Foundry application. We're going to create a Node.js sample application, and it'll just modify the simple sample application to use the single sign-on service. So we'll click on the button to create a Cloud Foundry app, and we'll pick SDK for Node.js. And then I'm going to type in a unique name, and SSO lab, make it unique, we'll give it a date. And everything else is the defaults. I'll click on Create. And this will create a new Cloud Foundry application using the Starter app. You will notice that this panel here is slightly different from the lab document. We'll get that updated later. But we're going to need a copy of the local code because we'll need to modify the app code to incorporate the single sign-on service. So I'm going to click on Download the Sample Code. And that'll download the starter code to my machine. And if you already have the Bluemix CLI installed, I do have that. If you don't have it and you want to get it, or you could get the Cloud Foundry CLI here from this link. So our next step is to unpack the code. There's our downloaded file. Just unzip it here. And I'll see I've got my package.json, app file, and the rest of the folders here. And then the next step you'll see in the lab is we mentioned that to sort of write down a ID that will be the prefix for the single sign-on service. We're just going to keep it simple, just use test SSO for that. It doesn't matter, it does not have to be unique. Okay, so it's time now to configure a copy of the single sign-on service in Bluemix. So I'm going back to my Bluemix dashboard and go to the service catalog. I'll type in here in the search field, single sign-on. Okay. Select the service tile. And if you have a paid Bluemix account with the ability to provision paid services, you'll see a Create button here. You can keep the service name at its default, and you can leave it unbound. We want it unbound until we've configured at least one identity provider for the service. So Create. Also bring up an initial configuration panel. I'll put in our name test SSO. This is going to be a part of the prefix for the UL for the identity broker. That's going to be part of our single sign-on service. So we'll see this test SSO a few more times. Click on Continue. So after a short delay, our control panel is up for the single sign-on service. We're going to start by creating an identity provider, identity source, the Cloud Directory identity source. I'm going to rename this my directory. And I'm going to add a user, username. We'll just call it Cloud User. Password. Click on Save to add the user. Save again. Now we see a single identity provider configured. Now we can select this and click on the gear icon. And here I can configure the policy appropriate for this identity provider. So for example, I can modify the password policy By default, it comes with none. We'll change it to medium. This will require an 8-character password and at least a minimum of 2 special characters or numeric characters. And we will save our changes to the directory. And now with the identity provider configured, we can bind this service to our application instance that we created. So to do the application bind, click over here, click on Apps, Cloud Foundry Apps to go to the Cloud Foundry dashboard. And here is the application that we created a moment ago. It's running. Let's click on its name to bring the control panel up for it. Right now it says I have no connections. I'm going to connect an existing service in this space. I just have one service in the space, and that's the single sign-on service. I'll select it. Click on Connect to confirm. It asks to restage. We can restage this. It's not particularly essential because we're going to be updating the application code and repushing the application. Okay. While this is restaging, we need to do one more step, and that is to configure the callback URL for our application. When I click on the single sign-on service here inside of the application dashboard context, I'll be opening up this service instance in the context of the application. What you'll see that's different here is that within the context of this connection, you'll see there's now an integrate button. We'll click on integrate. And here we get to configure the application. This is the return to URL, or it's also considered the callback URL. When the user has finished authenticating using the single sign-on service, and the single sign-on service will redirect the browser of the user back to this URL within the application. To match the code that we're going to be putting into the app.js file, we'll use the callback that looks something like this. Application name. And then append auth SSO callback. Okay. And we can leave all of these at their defaults. Okay. Our configuration has been saved. And at this point, we can go on to editing our application and repushing it back to Bluemix. Okay, for doing our application code editing, I'm going to use the Atom text editor. You can use whatever editor you are comfortable with. I'm going to open our project folder. And in the lab instructions, our first section is to update the package.json file so we get a new dependent. Copy these from the lab instructions. A comma here. Paste in the rest. Formatting looks good. And save the file. Next up, we're going to do some edits to the app.js file. You can use the app.js file, let's say appendix, to the lab. If you don't want to go through all these edits by hand, definitely use them so that you can copy paste. You don't want to type in all this stuff definitely from scratch. So, first part we're going to do is we are going to add some dependencies in for Passport and some other elements for Express so that we can do session tracking with Express. Passport is being used here because it's a Node.js authentication service, and we provide a strategy for OpenID Connect that can be used with the IBM OpenID Connect service within the single sign-on service. Okay, next up, after Express has been created, we want to add some middleware to Express. And then after this, we're going to put in some code to extract out the values from vcap services, which will be the environment variable that's set when the application is running inside of Bluemix. This will provide the credentials that we need to be able to connect to our single sign-on service. The other thing that's important when you're adding this bit of sample code is you need to change the callback URL to be your application name callback URL. Our matches there. Okay, now with the credentials that are parsed in from vcap services, let's add the code that will create our strategy for authentication using Passport and the single sign-on service that's bound to the application. Pull in our module for OpenID Connect, and then we create a new Passport authentication strategy using the values that we got from vcap services. Next up for the application, we need to define some routes in Express. So we're going to define a route that's going to be our login route, and then we'll also define a function that can be used to check to see through Passport if a user is already logged in or not. Also, we're configuring Passport to use the strategy we just defined in the call above. Now let's create the route for Express that's going to handle our callbacks from the single sign-on sessions, single sign-on service. And now to handle interaction with the users, we're going to add a couple more Express routes. First one, hello. We'll use that ensure authenticated function as a bit of middleware for Express to see if the user is already authenticated. If they are, then it will proceed on. Otherwise, it will do an authentication through the function. And then if their authentication fails, we actually have a failure route as well in Express. And the last thing we're going to add here, we're going to add the optional route for Express, which will initiate and trigger a log out process. And again, when this route is hit in Express, it'll call the logout method in the request item, which will proceed to do a Passport logout. And then it will send the browser to the single sign-on broker identity manager service to, at this point, trigger a logout for that user that's authenticated in with single sign-on service. So that's the changes that we need for app.js. Let's save the file. And the last thing we're going to do is we'll just do a little small tweak to the index file. We're going to modify this banner message here. It's a Node.js starter application with single sign-on. And then let's just add another table row. And we'll put in a button. We'll put a hello there. Set the type. Okay. That should give us a little button, and we'll press on the button, and that will then go into the hello route so we can test out our authentication and sign-in process. So we'll save the index file. And let's go back to our terminal prompt. And I'm already signed into Bluemix, so we'll skip that step. When I'm ready to push my application, I'll use bx app, Bluemix app, push. And this will take a moment as it pushes up the application artifacts, runs the builder for the application, and identifies a cell and launches the application on Bluemix. Okay, the build is completed, and we're starting up the application instance now. And there's the application running, and its health and status. Let's go over to a web browser window. One thing that's important to note with the single sign-on service, as we go back to our dashboard for application status, one thing that's important to note for the single sign-on service is that it uses the same identity provider as the Bluemix system itself. So if you were to go to this URL and click on the login button, in many cases it's going to use the identity provider that's associated with your Bluemix login, so we didn't get to test out our cloud user. Instead, if you want to test out your cloud user, you can just start up a new browser instance that does not have a sign-on context to IBM. So we'll do that by opening a link in a new incognito window. Let's make it just a little bigger. Click on login. And now it's going off and contacting the single sign-on service. You can see again this prefix test SSO that we provided. The single sign-on service will put up a chooser if there's multiple identity providers, or just a single sign-in page if there's just one, if we're going to the directory, if we're going to the IBM Cloud directory. You can also customize the look and feel of these pages through the service by editing the HTML associated with these panels. Let's sign in as cloud user. Since this is the first sign in with this user, it's going to say the password has been reset, you must change it. And now we must set a password that matches those rules that were specified. Once we have successfully logged in, you'll see an authentication message saying hello, and then a unique string that includes a realm for the user identification from the identity provider. Now we can go back to the URL again, and if I click on this button, I'm automatically logged in. Now I can also go here to the logout URL, and I get a message back from the single sign-on service identity provider that my logout succeeded. So if I go back to and click on login this time, I'm going to go back and I get the sign-in prompt. So that's it. Those are the steps to configure and set up a Node.js application using the Bluemix single sign-on service. Thanks for watching the lab.